The dining room smelled of roasted chicken and warm bread, but the air itself had turned to ice. I sat at the far end of the long oak table, the same table Margaret and I had bought 31 years ago from a small furniture shop that no longer existed, and I watched my son-in-law rise slowly from his chair. His napkin dropped from his lap and landed on the hardwood floor like a small white flag of surrender, except Curtis Aldridge had never surrendered anything in his life. He simply took what he wanted and called it destiny. "This house isn't yours anymore, old man," he said, his voice booming through the room loud enough that the crystal glasses on the sideboard seemed to tremble. "You're a guest here. You've been a guest here for 2 years, and it's time guests learn their place." My daughter Claire sat frozen beside him, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and me like a woman watching a car accident she was powerless to stop. My 2 grandchildren, Emma and Noah, sat across from me in stunned silence, a silence so complete that I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the same clock Margaret had insisted on keeping even after 3 different movers told her it wasn't worth the trouble. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand. I simply set down my fork, folded my hands together on the white linen tablecloth, and looked at the man who had just tried to humiliate me in front of my own grandchildren. "Is that so, Curtis?" I said quietly. "That's so," he snapped, straightening his tie with the smug confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He walked slowly around the head of the table as he spoke, one hand trailing possessively along the back of each chair, as if reminding everyone seated at that table exactly whose house he believed this had become. "Tomorrow morning, you're going to start looking for an apartment, a nice little senior community, maybe somewhere with a call button by the bed. This house needs to breathe. It needs a family living in it, not some sad old man sulking around in his dead wife's bathrobe." He stopped directly behind my chair, close enough that I could smell the cologne he had started wearing sometime in the past year. Something expensive and sharp, entirely unlike the modest, practical man Claire had first brought home to meet us 14 years earlier. "You've had a good run here, Frank," he continued, his voice dropping into something meant to sound almost kind, almost reasonable, the particular tone men use when they want cruelty to sound like mercy. 2 years is more generosity than most sons-in-law would show. But this is my house now. My name is the one that matters here. It's time you understood that. The mention of Margaret's bathrobe hit me harder than anything else he could have said. I felt the old anger rising in my chest, hot and sudden. The same anger I used to feel 40 years ago when a competitor tried to undercut my company on a bid I had spent 3 sleepless weeks preparing. But I had learned, over 6 decades of building something out of nothing, that anger shown too early is a weapon handed to your enemy. I let it pass through me like a wave over a breakwater, and I smiled instead. "You're absolutely right, Curtis," I said, my voice calm and even. "It probably is time for a change around here." Curtis blinked, clearly thrown off by my agreement. He had wanted a fight. He had wanted tears, pleading, the satisfaction of watching a broken old man beg to stay in the only home he had left. Instead, he got a smile he did not understand, because he did not know what I knew. He did not know what was sitting in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of my study, 3 floors below the room we were sitting in. He did not know that in exactly 9 hours, his entire comfortable little kingdom would collapse around him like a house built on sand during high tide. Before I tell you exactly how a 70-year-old man dismantled the empire his son-in-law thought he had already stolen, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. If you've ever had to sit quietly at a table while someone underestimated you completely, hit that like button, because what happened next is exactly what happens when you corner a man who spent his whole life building things with his bare hands. To understand how we arrived at that unbearable dinner table, you need to go back exactly 3 days. 3 days earlier, I woke up before sunrise in the small guest bedroom at the back of the house. The room Claire had converted for me after Margaret passed, and I sold our old place on Larkspur Lane. I want to be honest with you about something right at the start of this story, because it matters for everything that comes after. I did not move into my daughter's house because I was broke, and I did not move in because I had nowhere else to go. I moved in because 18 months after burying my wife of 42 years, I could not stand the silence of an empty house any longer. Every room in that house on Larkspur Lane held a memory of Margaret, and every memory was a knife. I sold the house for $2.3 million. Put the money where I always put money, quietly and carefully, and I told Claire I would love nothing more than to spend my remaining years close to my grandchildren. What Claire did not know, and what Curtis certainly did not know, was that I had used a portion of that money to secretly help them buy the very house we were all living in. 2 years ago, when Curtis's restaurant supply business was drowning in debt and the bank had rejected their mortgage application twice, I quietly stepped into a private trust that Margaret and I had established decades earlier, a trust that existed specifically to protect our family from moments exactly like this one. The trust purchased the house outright. Curtis and Claire believed they were paying a mortgage to a private lender named Ashcroft Holdings. They had no idea that Ashcroft Holdings was simply the name Margaret had chosen for our family trust back in 1994, named after the street where we had our very first office. I did this because I love my daughter, and because at the time, I still believe her husband was simply a man struggling under the weight of bad luck, rather than a man who had built his entire adult identity on borrowed money and borrowed confidence. I did not tell him the truth because I did not want Curtis to feel indebted to me, and I especially did not want him to feel entitled to more than what he had earned. I wanted him to build something real. I wanted to watch my daughter's husband become a man worthy of the family he had married into. I was wrong about him. I had been wrong about him for a very long time, and it took the events of those 3 days to finally show me exactly how wrong I had been. That morning, I made my usual pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen island, reading the newspaper the way I had done every single morning for 50 years, back when newspapers still arrived folded on porches, instead of scrolling silently across glowing screens. Claire came downstairs first, already dressed for a job at the elementary school where she taught 3rd grade, her face carrying the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been arguing quietly with her husband for longer than she wanted to admit. "Morning, Dad," she said, kissing the top of my head the way she had done since she was a little girl standing on a kitchen stool to reach me. "Morning, sweetheart," I said, folding the newspaper. "You look tired." She hesitated at the coffee maker, her back to me, her shoulders tight beneath her cardigan. "Curtis and I had a rough night," she admitted quietly. "The business is struggling again. He's been talking about restructuring, whatever that means. He gets so tense about money." I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach, the same knot I felt 18 months earlier when Curtis first came to me, hat in hand, asking for a personal loan to cover payroll. I had given it to him then, $140,000, quietly, without telling Claire, because I did not want my daughter to know how close her husband's business had come to collapsing. He had paid back exactly $11,000 of it over the following year and a half before the payments simply stopped arriving. "Is there anything I can do?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "No, Dad, it's fine," Claire said quickly, the same way she had said it for the past 2 years, the same practiced deflection she used whenever the subject of Curtis's business troubles came up. "He just needs some time to figure things out. He's under a lot of pressure." I nodded and let the subject drop, though I had learned decades ago that when a man says he is under a lot of pressure while his wife watches him with tired, worried eyes, there's usually something far more complicated happening beneath the surface than simple financial stress. Curtis came downstairs 20 minutes later, dressed in one of the expensive tailored suits he wore even though his restaurant supply company had not turned a real profit in over a year. He had always been like that, more concerned with appearing successful than actually building something that could survive contact with reality. He kissed Claire on the cheek, poured himself coffee without acknowledging me, and stood at the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone with the particular intensity of a man checking numbers he did not want to see. "Everything all right, Curtis?" I asked, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. He looked up at me, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face, something calculating and cold that I had seen before in boardrooms full of men trying to figure out how to squeeze one more concession out of negotiation. Then it was gone, replaced by his usual practice charm. "Everything's great, Frank," he said, using my first name the way he always did, never once in 2 years calling me anything closer to family. "Just business stuff. You wouldn't understand. It's pretty complicated." I let that comment slide off me the way I let most of his condescension slide off me, because I had learned long ago that a man who needs to remind you he is smarter than you rarely is. I finished my coffee, kissed Claire goodbye as she headed off to school, and watched Curtis leave for whatever office he still pretended to run. I spent that morning the way I spent most mornings since retiring, tending to the modest garden behind the house, the one small piece of the property that felt entirely mine. I had planted tomatoes and peppers along the back fence, and Margaret's favorite roses along the side of the garage. Roses I had transplanted from our old house on Larkspur Lane, because I could not bear to leave them behind for strangers to enjoy. I was kneeling in the dirt around 11 in the morning when I heard my phone buzz inside my jacket pocket. It was a text message from an unknown number. I nearly ignored it, assuming it was spam, but something made me open it. The message was brief and utterly bewildering. Mr. Doss, this is Renata from First Colonial Title. We have your signature request ready for the refinance closing on 1440 Birchwood Lane. Please call our office at your earliest convenience to confirm the wire instructions for the buyout amount. I sat back on my heels in the dirt, staring at my phone screen. 1440 Birchwood Lane was the address of the house I was currently kneeling behind. A refinance, a buyout amount, a signature request. I had signed nothing. I had authorized nothing. And more importantly, the title to that house was not even in my name, or in Curtis and Claire's names. It belonged to Ashcroft Holdings, our family trust, a fact that only 3 people alive were supposed to know about. Myself, our longtime attorney Elliot Marsh, and, as of Margaret's passing, technically Claire, though I had never told her the specifics because I had been waiting for the right moment. Someone was trying to refinance a house. They should not have had any legal ability to refinance. Someone was forging documents using my name. I sat there in the dirt for a long moment before I finally worked up the resolve to call the number back, my knees aching from kneeling too long among the tomato plants, my heart beating with a strange, unfamiliar unease that fell entirely out of proportion to what I still believed, in that moment, might simply be some kind of clerical mix-up. Title companies made mistakes all the time. I told myself, wrong names got attached to the wrong files constantly in an industry that processed thousands of documents a week. There was probably a simple, boring explanation waiting for me on the other end of that phone call. Something involving a data entry error or a similarly named property 3 counties over. I called the number immediately. A pleasant young woman answered, and I explained, as calmly as I could manage, that I had never authorized any such transaction and needed to know exactly who had initiated it. She apologized for confusion, checked her records, and read me the name attached to the loan application. Curtis Aldridge, acting under limited power of attorney granted by Frank Doss. I had never granted my son-in-law power of attorney over anything. Not my finances, not my medical decisions, not so much as my mail. The knot in my stomach that had been forming all morning tightened into something hard and cold. Ma'am, I said carefully, I need copies of every document associated with this transaction sent to my personal email immediately. I did not sign any power of attorney, and I did not authorize this refinance. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the sound of nervous shuffling, and a muffled conversation with someone else in the office. When she came back, her voice had lost its pleasant, practiced tone. Mr. Doss, I'm going to have my manager call you back within the hour. I apologize, but this situation may need to be escalated. I hung up the phone and sat in my garden for a long time, the sun warm on my back, the smell of turned earth and tomato leaves filling the air, while my mind raced through decades of business experience trying to piece together what was happening. My son-in-law was attempting to secretly refinance a house that was not legally his, using a forged power of attorney bearing my name, in order to extract cash from a property he did not actually own. I thought about the $140,000 loan he had never repaid. I thought about his tense conversation about restructuring that Claire had mentioned that very morning. I thought about the flicker of something cold and calculating I had seen cross his face in the kitchen. And I understood, with a particular clarity that comes to a man who has spent his entire life reading people across negotiating tables, that Curtis Aldridge was drowning, and he was planning to use my dead wife's trust as his life raft, without my permission, without my knowledge, and without a single thought about what would do to me or to his own wife when it all came crashing down. I did not call Curtis. I did not confront him over phone. I did what I had always done when I discovered a problem buried deep inside a business deal. I went quiet and I went to work. I drove to Elliot Marsh's office that same afternoon. Elliot had been our family attorney for nearly 30 years, a sharp, silver-haired man in his early 70s who had helped Margaret and me set up the Ashcroft Trust back when our modest hardware supply business was just beginning to turn real profit. He had drafted the paperwork that protected everything we built from exactly this kind of situation, though neither of us had ever imagined the threat would come from inside our own family. Elliot listened without interrupting as I laid out everything I knew: the text message, the forged power of attorney, the refinance application. When I finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long, slow breath. "Frank, I want to be very clear with you," he said. "A forged power of attorney used to fraudulently refinance trust property is not a family squabble. That's a felony. That's real prison time if it's proven and pursued." "I understand that," I said. "Do you want to pursue it that way?" Elliot asked, watching me carefully over the top of his reading glasses. "Because there's a difference between protecting the trust quietly and destroying your daughter's marriage in a courtroom. I need to know which one you're asking me to help you do." I thought about Claire, sitting at the kitchen island that morning with tired eyes, telling me everything was fine while clearly knowing it was not. I thought about my grandchildren, Emma and Noah, who adore their father despite everything, who had no idea the ground beneath their entire family was quietly cracking apart. "I want the truth first," I said finally. "I want to know exactly how deep this goes before I decide how to handle it. Can you pull the trust's financial history? Every transaction tied to Ashcroft Holdings for the past 2 years." Elliot nodded and made a note on his legal pad. "I can have my paralegal start on that this afternoon. But Frank, if he was bold enough to forge a power of attorney with your name on it, I have to ask you something uncomfortable. Where did he get your signature? Where did he get enough personal information to make this look legitimate to a title company?" I sat quietly for a moment in the worn leather chair across from Elliot's desk, the same chair I had sat in decades earlier when Margaret and I first walked into his office as two nervous young business owners tried to understand the legal difference between an LLC and a partnership. Elliot's office had changed very little since those early years. The same dark with bookshelves lined with law volumes. The same brass desk lamp casting warm light across scattered case files. Though Elliot himself had gone from a sharp-eyed man in his early 40s to a sharp-eyed man in his early 70s, the years having stolen nothing from his instincts even as they slowed his gait. "Elliot," I said, "I've trusted you with everything Margaret and I ever built. I trusted you when we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, and I trusted you when we had more money than either of us ever imagined we'd see in one lifetime. I'm trusting you now. Whatever this turns into, I need you standing next to me the whole way through it." "You've had my loyalty for 30 years, Frank," Elliot said, closing his legal pad. "You'll have it for however many more years either of us is left. But I need you to promise me something in return. Don't do anything rash before we have the full picture. A man who moves too fast on partial information usually ends up handing his opponent exactly the leverage they were hoping for." I nodded, though even then, sitting in that familiar leather chair, some quiet part of me already understood that patience was going to be the hardest part of everything that followed. That question about the signature sat with me the entire drive home, heavier than anything else that had happened that day. Where had Curtis gotten my signature? I thought about every document I had signed the past 2 years while living under his roof, every birthday card, every check I had written for Emma's dance recitals and Noah's Little League fees, every piece of mail that passed through that house before reaching my hands. Somewhere in that ordinary domestic paper trail, my son-in-law had found what he needed to begin building a forgery. I did not sleep well that night. I lay awake in the small guest bedroom, listening to the house settle around me, listening to Curtis and Claire's muffled voices through the thin wall, separating the guest room from their bedroom above the garage, unable to make out words, but able to hear the particular strained rhythm of 2 people who had been fighting quietly for months without either of them saying what actually needed to be said. I thought, lying there in the dark, about how Margaret and I had built everything we owned from absolutely nothing. We were both 26 years old when we opened the doors of our first hardware supply storefront, a cramped little shop wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered shoe repair business on a street that no longer even exists in its original form. We had exactly $4,000 between us, borrowed partly from our parents and partly from a small business loan that took us 11 months of paperwork and rejection letters to finally secure. I remember the exact smell of that first shop, sawdust and machine oil, and the particular mustiness of a building that had stood empty for 2 years before we moved in. Margaret kept the books at a card table in the back room because we could not afford a real office desk for the first year and a half. I drove the delivery truck myself every single morning before sunrise because we could not afford to hire a driver, and I unloaded every pallet by hand because we could not afford a forklift either. We built that little shop into a regional supply company over the course of 11 years, then into a multi-state distribution business over following 2 decades. And by the time I finally sold my controlling interest and stepped back from daily operations at the age of 62, the company employed just under 400 people across 7 states. Every single dollar of it, every warehouse, every delivery route, every long-term contract had been built with the two of us working side by side, arguing over spreadsheets at our kitchen table late into the night, celebrating small victories with cheap champagne poured into mismatched glasses because we were too proud to admit we could not yet afford the good kind. We built the Ashcroft Trust specifically because we had watched, over the years, more than one family we knew personally torn apart by money. We watched a business partner of mine lose his entire company to a son-in-law who had slowly, quietly maneuvered himself into a position of control over accounts he should never have been allowed near. We watched a neighbor's daughter marry a man who systematically drained her inheritance within 4 years, leaving her with nothing but debt and a broken marriage to show for a lifetime of her parents' careful saving. Margaret used to say that money without protection was simply an invitation for someone patient enough to wait for your guard to drop. She was the one who insisted, over my initial objections that it all felt unnecessarily suspicious of people we loved, that we build legal walls around everything we had earned, walls strong enough to survive not just bad luck, but bad people. I had never imagined, not once in 30 years, that those walls would need to be tested against a member of our own family. But lying awake that second night, listening to my daughter's quiet, worried voice of the wall, I understood with a growing certainty that the walls Margaret had insisted on building decades earlier were about to become the only thing standing between my daughter's future and complete ruin. The following morning, the second of my 3 days, I woke early and made a decision that would define everything that followed. I decided I would not confront Curtis directly. Not yet. Instead, I would do what I had done decades earlier when a supplier tried to secretly undercut our contracts by falsifying delivery records. I would watch, I would gather, and when the moment was right, I would present an amount of evidence so complete and so undeniable that there would be no room left for lies, no room left for excuses, no room left for anything except the truth landing exactly where it needed to land. I called Robert Kessler that afternoon, a private investigator I had used exactly once before, 15 years earlier, when a competitor's employee had been quietly leaking our bids to a rival firm. Robert was in his early 60s now, a former state fraud investigator who had built a small, quiet, extremely effective practice handling exactly the kind of family and financial cases most people never wanted to admit they needed help with. Frank Doss, Robert said when he picked up the phone, genuine warmth in his voice. It's been a long time. How's retirement treating you? Not as peacefully as advertised, I said. I need your help, Robert. And I need it quiet. I met him that evening at a diner off the interstate, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booze and coffee that had probably been sitting on the burner since breakfast. Exactly the kind of anonymous place where a man could lay out his family's unraveling without worrying about familiar faces overhearing. I told him everything. The refinance attempt, the forged power of attorney, the unpaid loan, the strange tension I had watched building in my daughter's marriage for months without fully understanding what it meant. I need to know what he's actually doing with his business. I told Robert, I need to know where the money from that $140,000 loan actually went. And I need to know whether this refinance scheme was a one-time act of desperation or part of something bigger. Robert took careful notes on a small leather notebook, the same kind he had carried 15 years earlier. Give me 72 hours, he said. I'll pull his business filings, his banking relationships where I can legally access them, and I'll talk to a few people who owe me favors at the county recorder's office. If there's a pattern here, Frank, I'll find it. He closed his notebook and looked at me with the particular steadiness of a man who had spent a career watching families quietly destroy themselves. I have to ask you something, Frank, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Are you prepared for what I might find? In my experience, when a man forges a signature to pull cash out of a house, the refinance is never the whole story. It's usually just the first crack in the dam. Once I start pulling threads, I don't stop until the whole sweater comes apart. I've spent 40 years reading financial statements for a living, Robert. I said, I've caught men trying to hide six figures behind falsified shipping manifests. I think I can handle whatever you find. This is different, Robert said quietly, and something in his tone made me look up from my coffee. This isn't a stranger trying to steal from your company. This is the man sleeping down the hall from your granddaughter's bedroom every night. Whatever I find is going to sit at your daughter's dinner table tomorrow morning, wearing a smile like nothing's wrong. That's a harder kind of knowing than anything you dealt with in a boardroom. I sat with that for a long moment, turning my coffee cup slowly on the cracked linoleum tabletop. Find it anyway. I said finally, whatever it is, I'd rather carry the whole truth myself than let my daughter walk blind into whatever this man is building behind her back. Robert nodded slowly, tucked his notebook into his jacket pocket, and slid out of the booth. Before he left, he turned back one more time. For what it's worth, Frank, most people who hire me are trying to catch a cheating spouse or a partner skimming off the top. It's rare that someone hires me to protect a daughter who's not even legally his responsibility anymore. You didn't have to do any of this. She's still my daughter, I said simply. That doesn't come with an expiration date. I drove home that night feeling the particular heavy calm that comes before a storm, the calm of a man who has finally stopped reacting and started preparing. When I walked to the front door, Curtis was sitting in the living room with a glass of scotch, watching some financial news program with the sound turned low. He glanced up at me with an expression I might have missed if I had not spent the day thinking so carefully about the man wearing it. "Where were you tonight, Frank?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Claire said you were out late." "Just having dinner with an old friend," I said easily. You know how it is when you get to my age. Not many of us left to have dinner with. He studied me for a moment longer than was comfortable, then returned his attention to the television. "Sure," he said. "Well, good to see you're still getting out there." I climbed the stairs to my small room that night with a growing certainty that Curtis Aldridge was not simply a desperate man who had made one bad decision under financial pressure. He was watching me. He was measuring me. And somewhere behind that carefully maintained charm, he had already begun calculating what he would need to do if his forged power of attorney scheme fell apart. The third day began with an emergency that had nothing to do with Curtis at all, though it would end up revealing more about him than anything Robert Kessler's investigation could have produced. I was in the kitchen making breakfast for my grandchildren, a small ritual I had maintained since moving in. Cracking eggs into the same cast iron skillet I had used every morning for longer than Curtis and Claire had been married, when Emma, my 11-year-old granddaughter, came downstairs clutching her stomach and looking pale as chalk. She tried to smile at me, tried to tell me she was fine, and just needed to sit down for a moment. The way children do when they do not yet understand how badly something inside them has gone wrong. Within 20 minutes, she was doubled over on the kitchen floor in genuine agony, her small body curling in on itself, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps that terrified me more than almost anything I had witnessed in years. Claire came flying down the stairs in her bathrobe the moment she heard Emma cry out, and within minutes we were in the emergency room. Claire driving her own car with Emma in the back seat, while I followed close behind in my truck, my hands shaking on the steering wheel in a way they had not shaken since the night we rushed Margaret to the hospital during her final illness. By the time we reached the emergency room, the pediatric surgeon on call was already discussing the strong possibility of an appendix on the verge of rupturing, his voice calm but urgent in particular way doctors speak when they're trying not to frighten a room full of people who are already terrified. I called Curtis myself, standing in the hallway outside the triage room, while Claire stayed pressed close to Emma's gurney. He picked up on the fourth ring, his voice thick with sleep, and I told him, as plainly as I could manage, that his daughter was being prepped for a possible emergency surgery, and that he needed to get to the hospital immediately. Curtis, notably, took nearly 40 minutes to arrive after that call. And when he finally walked through the emergency room doors, he was not disheveled with worry the way a frightened father should have been. He was freshly showered, dressed in a clean pressed shirt, his hair combed, carrying particular composed calm, a man who had taken careful time to prepare himself before appearing in public. Even during what should have been a moment of pure parental panic, there was no urgency in his walk, no wild-eyed searching for his family the moment he entered the waiting room. He moved the way a man moves when he is arriving at a meeting he has already rehearsed. I noticed it. Claire, consumed with worry for our granddaughter, did not. Emma was rushed into emergency surgery within the hour, her appendix having ruptured just as the surgeon feared. Claire sat in the sterile waiting room clutching my hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, tears streaming silently down her face, while Curtis paced near the window, checked his phone every few minutes with an intensity that seemed disproportionate even for a worried father. I picked up Claire's hand across the table, the pediatric surgeon's words about ruptured appendixes and blood loss still ringing distantly in my ears, and I told her the same thing I had told her when she was 7 years old and terrified of the dark, that whatever happened next, she would not have to face it alone. She squeezed my hand back, her eyes red and swollen, and for just a moment, sitting there in that cold plastic waiting room chair, we were simply father and daughter again, stripped of every complication that had grown between us over the years, holding on to each other the way we had when she was small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. "Curtis," I said quietly, watching him check his phone for what must have been the 15th time in 20 minutes. "Everything all right?" "Just business," he muttered, not looking up. "There's a wire transfer deadline today. If it doesn't clear by 3 o'clock, I'm going to lose the vendor discount on an entire shipment." He said it flatly, distractedly, the way a man might mention forgetting to take out the trash, utterly unaware of how obscene the comparison sounded spoken aloud in a hospital corridor while his daughter lay unconscious on an operating table 2 floors below us. I stared at him, genuinely struggling to comprehend the words coming out of his mouth. Our 11-year-old granddaughter was in emergency surgery, her ruptured appendix threatening infection and complications that could last for weeks, and her father was worried about a vendor discount deadline, checking stock prices and shipment manifests in a room where every other person present had their entire attention fixed on a set of double doors that would eventually open to deliver either relief or devastation. "Curtis," I said again, my voice harder this time, "your daughter is in surgery." He finally looked up at me, and for just a moment, the mask slipped completely. I saw something in his eyes that chilled me more than anything Robert Kessler could have reported back to me. It was not worry. It was not fear for his daughter. It was irritation, pure and simple, irritation that an inconvenient medical emergency had interrupted whatever financial maneuver he had been quietly executing that afternoon. "I know that, Frank," he said sharply, straightening his tie. "I'm not stupid. I'm just trying to keep this family's finances from completely collapsing while everyone else falls apart around me. Somebody has to stay level-headed." He walked out of the waiting room a few minutes later, claiming he needed to make an urgent phone call, and did not return for nearly an hour. When he finally came back, he wore the appropriately worried expression of a concerned father, as if he had simply flipped a switch and put the correct mask back on. Claire, exhausted and terrified, did not question where he had gone, but I did. I sat alone in that waiting room for the better part of that missing hour, watching the sliding glass doors at the far end of the corridor, half expecting to see him walk back through them, explaining some reasonable, mundane errand. Instead, when he finally returned, there was a particular flush to his face, a restless energy in the way he kept glancing at his phone even as he sat down beside Claire, and took her hand, offering her exactly the right words to come for a moment too late, to feel genuine. I had spent 40 years in boardrooms watching men perform sincerity they did not feel, and I recognized the performance the instant I saw it. Something about that missing hour would not leave me alone for the rest of that long, exhausting night, sitting in those uncomfortable plastic chairs while surgeons worked to save my granddaughter's life 2 floors below us. And that evening, once Emma was safely out of surgery and resting in recovery, stable and expected to make a full recovery within a few weeks, I stepped outside the hospital into the cool night air and called Robert Kessler. "I need everything you have," I said. "Whatever you found in the last 48 hours. I need it now. Frank, I was actually about to call you, Robert said, and I could hear papers shuffling on his end of the line. I think you should sit down for this. I'm standing in a hospital parking lot, Robert. Just tell me. He exhaled slowly. Curtis Aldridge's restaurant supply business has been operating at a significant loss for over 16 months. He's been quietly taking out short-term high-interest loans from at least 3 different private lending companies to cover payroll and inventory, and every single one of those loans is now in default or dangerously close to it. He owes just under $310,000 in outstanding debt across those lenders alone. I close my eyes, leaning against the cold brick wall of the hospital, feeling the weight of every number Robert listed. And the $140,000 I loaned him 18 months ago. Gone within 4 months, Robert said. Not into the business. Frank, I traced most of it. About $60,000 went to 2 of his short-term lenders to cover an earlier default. The rest went into a separate personal account he's been maintaining that Claire, as far as I can tell, has absolutely no knowledge of. My hand tightened around the phone. What's the account for? That's the part one thing you need to see for yourself, Robert said. I'll send everything over tonight. But Frank, there's something else. Something bigger than the money. Tell me. The refinance application on the house, the one that started this whole thing, wasn't a one-time act of panic. It was step 3 of a plan. Step 1 was draining what remained of his business credit. Step 2 was the personal account I just mentioned. Step 3, refinancing a house he doesn't legally own using a forged power of attorney, was meant to pull enough equity out to cover his lending defaults before anyone came looking for collateral. If that refinance had gone through, Frank, he would have pulled almost $400,000 in cash out of property held by your family trust, using your forged signature, without you or Claire ever knowing until the debt collectors came looking for the house itself. I stood in that parking lot for a long time after Robert hung up, the hospital's fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above me, my granddaughter resting safely inside after surgery, my son-in-law somewhere in that building wearing a mask of concern I now understood was as fraudulent as the power of attorney he had forged with my name. A light rain had begun to fall, fine and cold, beating on the shoulders of my jacket, and I remember thinking, standing there getting quietly soaked in a hospital parking lot at nearly midnight, that this was perhaps the strangest and loneliest moment of my life since the week Margaret passed, discovering an entirely different kind of loss, the loss of trust in a man I had welcomed into my family with open arms 14 years earlier. I thought about Margaret, about the trust she had insisted we build so carefully, about the roses I had transplanted from our old house, because I could not bear to lose one more piece of her. And I thought about the man who was, at that very moment, trying to steal it all out from under a family too exhausted and too trusting to notice. I did not go back inside the hospital in anger. I went back inside with the same cold, focused calm I had carried into every major negotiation of my professional life. I sat with Claire through the rest of that long night, held her hand, told her Emma was going to be perfectly fine, and I let Curtis continue believing that his sweet, harmless father-in-law had no idea what was quietly unraveling behind his back. Over the following 2 days, while Emma recovered in the hospital and then slowly at home, I did not confront Curtis. I watched him play the role of devoted father in front of Claire and the nurses, bringing flowers to Emma's hospital room, posting a single carefully worded message on social media about how family was everything, all while I knew, with absolute certainty now, exactly what he'd been trying to do the moment before his daughter's medical emergency interrupted him. Robert Kessler sent over the full file that second night, and I read through alone in my small guest bedroom with the door locked, a cup of black coffee going cold beside me. The personal account Robert had mentioned told a story far more disturbing than simple financial desperation. Over the past year, Curtis had been funneling money into what appeared to be an entirely separate life, payments to a rented storage unit in a town 40 minutes away that Claire had never once mentioned, recurring charges to a boutique hotel near the airport, and monthly transfers to an account belonging to a woman named Vanessa Cole, a name that meant absolutely nothing to me until Robert's notes explained that Vanessa Cole was a former employee of Curtis's restaurant supply business, terminated 14 months earlier under circumstances the company's own internal records described only as a mutual separation. I sat with that information for a long time, feeling something colder than anger settle into my chest. My son-in-law was not simply drowning in bad business decisions. He was living an entire second life funded partly by my own money, a life that included a woman he had been paying quietly and consistently for over a year. I called Elliot Marsh the next morning and told him everything. "Frank," Elliot said after long silence, "you have enough here to end this man's marriage, his business, and very possibly his freedom, all in one motion. The question I have to ask you again, more seriously this time, is what you actually want the outcome to be." I thought about Claire, and I thought about my grandchildren, and I thought about the woman I had married 42 years earlier, who had built this family's foundation stone by stone right alongside me, and who had been utterly heartbroken to watch a man like Curtis Aldridge nearly succeed and tear it all down. "I want him gone," I said finally, my voice steady. "I want him completely out of my daughter's life, and I want it done in a way that protects Claire and the kids from every single consequence of his choices. I want the house secured. I want the debt exposed before it ever touches Claire's name. And I want him to understand, in front of everyone, exactly what kind of man he actually is." "Then here's what we're going to do," Elliot said. Over the next 2 days, Elliot Marsh, Robert Kessler, and I built a case with the same methodical patience I had once used to build an entire company out of a single small hardware supply contract. Elliot drafted formal documentation proving the fraudulent power of attorney and the attempted refinance, along with full accounting of the trust's true ownership of the house, ready to be filed with both the title company and, if necessary, local law enforcement. Robert compiled every financial record, every hidden transfer, every payment to the storage unit in the hotel in Vanessa Cole, organized into a binder, so complete it read like a confession Curtis had unknowingly written himself over the course of a year. I also did something I had not initially planned to do. I quietly visited the storage unit facility Robert had identified, presented myself simply as a family member helping to sort through some paperwork, a small lie that got me nowhere close to the actual unit but confirmed, through a friendly conversation with the manager, that the unit had indeed been rented under Curtis's name for the past 11 months, and that the monthly payments were, without exception, made in cash. The manager, a heavy-set man named Gary, who clearly had no reason to suspect anything unusual about my questions, mentioned almost in passing that the unit was one of their larger climate-controlled spaces, the kind people typically rented for furniture, not for the handful of boxes a man might store if he were simply hiding paperwork. That detail sat uneasily with me the entire drive home. 2 evenings later, against Elliot's mild objection that I was beginning to overstep the boundary between gathering evidence and conducting my own private investigation, I sat in my truck across the street from a small Italian restaurant 20 minutes outside of town, a place Robert's record showed Curtis had visited on 6 separate occasions over the past 4 months. Always on a weeknight, always between the hours of 7 and 9, always claiming to Claire that he was meeting with a vendor about supply contracts. I watched Curtis's car pull into the lot just after 7 that evening. I watched a woman in her early 30s, dark-haired, dressed simply but carefully, step out of a small silver sedan and walk toward the entrance a few minutes behind him. I did not need Robert's photographs to know who she was. I had already seen her name enough times in the financial records to recognize the particular way Curtis greeted her at the door, his hand resting briefly on the small of her back in a gesture far too familiar for a former employee discussing unfinished business matters. I sat in that truck for nearly 2 hours, watching the restaurant's warm yellow windows, feeling something heavier than anger settle into my chest, a kind of tired grief for my daughter that I had not expected. I thought about Clara home that night, likely grading papers at the kitchen table, believing her husband was somewhere discussing vendor contracts, while he sat 20 minutes away sharing a bottle of wine with a woman who had clearly become far more than a business acquaintance. When Curtis finally walked back out to his car alone, nearly 2 hours later, I did not follow him. I had seen everything I needed to see. I drove home in silence, and when I passed the guest bedroom mirror later that night, I barely recognized the tired, hardened expression staring back at me. Elliot called me into his office one final time before that dinner, laying a complete portfolio across his desk and walking me through every page, every exhibit, every carefully numbered tab, the way he might have once walked a nervous client through a complicated acquisition agreement. "Frank," he said, closing the final folder and looking up at me over his reading glasses. "I want you to understand exactly what you're holding here before you sit down at that table tomorrow. This isn't just enough to protect the house. This is enough to end his marriage, end his business, and quite possibly end his freedom, depending on how far you decide to push it with the district attorney's office. Once you open this folder in front of your daughter, there is no closing it again. There's no version of tomorrow where this family goes back to pretending everything is fine." "I know that," I said quietly. "Then I need you to be certain," Elliot said. "Not angry certain. Certain the way you used to be certain before you signed a contract that was going to bind this family for the next 20 years. I sat with his question for a long moment, staring down at that leather portfolio, thinking about Margaret, about the trust she had insisted we build, about the 2 years I had spent quietly watching a man slowly, patiently work his way towards stealing something that had never belonged to him in the first place. "I'm certain," I said finally. By the third evening, I had everything I needed. Every document, every transaction record, every piece of evidence assembled into a single leather portfolio that Elliot had prepared, ready to be presented at exactly the right moment. I chose that moment carefully. I chose the family dinner, the same dinner where Curtis had spent the previous 2 years slowly asserting his dominance over a house he did not own and a family he had been quietly betraying. Because I wanted to understand, in front of Claire and in front of our grandchildren, once they were old enough to hear the full truth someday, that his cruelty and his greed had cornered him precisely because he had never once imagined the quiet old man at the end of the table was capable of building a trap this complete. That brings us back to that dinner, the one I described at the very beginning of the story. The dinner where Curtis Aldridge stood up from his chair and told me, in front of my daughter and my grandchildren, that I was nothing more than a guest in a house he believed belonged to him. "You're absolutely right, Curtis," I had said, smiling calmly while he stood there, confused by my agreement. "It probably is time for a change around here." I reached down beside my chair and lifted the leather portfolio I had brought to the table, setting it gently on the white linen tablecloth in front of me. Claire glanced at it, then at me, her brow furrowing with confusion that had not yet turned to understanding. "Dad, what is that?" she asked quietly. "Claire, sweetheart, I want you to look at something before your husband finishes telling me to pack my bags," I said, my voice still calm, still even, still carrying none of the fury I felt burning quietly beneath the surface. I opened the portfolio and slid the first document across the table toward her. It was a title record for the house we were sitting in, showing clear as day that the property belonged not to Curtis and Claire, but to Ashcroft Holdings, a private family trust established by Margaret and me nearly 30 years earlier. "This house has never belonged to you, Curtis," I said, watching the color begin to drain from his face. "It belongs to a trust your mother-in-law and I built together, long before either of you were married. I purchased it outright for you and Claire as a gift, quietly, because I love my daughter and I want to give her family a stable home. I never told either of you the full truth, because I trusted you to build something honest here without needing to know." "Dad, I don't understand," Claire whispered, her eyes wide as she stared at the document in her trembling hands. "You will," I said gently, before turning my gaze back to Curtis, whose confident posture had begun to crumble in real time, his shoulders sagging, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Because 3 days ago, Curtis, you attempted to secretly refinance this house using a forged power of attorney bearing my signature in order to pull nearly $400,000 out of property that has never once belonged to you." The room fell into a silence so total that I could hear Noah's fork slip quietly from his fingers and clatter against his dinner plate. Emma, still weak from her surgery just days earlier, looked between her parents with the frightened confusion of a child sensing catastrophe without yet understanding its shape. "That's insane," Curtis stammered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the panic rising beneath his forced outrage. "I don't know what you're talking about, Frank. This is exactly the kind of paranoid nonsense I'd expect from a grieving old man losing his grip." I slid the second document across the table, the forged power of attorney itself, my signature clumsily traced from an old birthday card I had given Noah, the mismatched pressure and hesitation marks visible even to an untrained I once you knew to look for them. "I've spent my entire career reading contracts, Curtis," I said quietly. "I know my own signature. And so does the fraud examiner Elliot Marsh retained, who has already confirmed the signature was traced, not written. Curtis's mouth opened, then closed, no words emerging. I slid the third document across the table, and then the fourth, and then the fifth, laying out the full picture with the same deliberate, unhurried patience I had once used to walk a boardroom full of skeptical investors through a business plan. The $140,000 loan, mostly unpaid. The 3 separate high-interest lenders now circling him with default notices. Their letterhead stamped in the aggressive red ink collection agencies. Favor once patience has run out. The hidden personal account, its transaction history highlighted in careful yellow marker by Robert's own hand. The storage unit rented under his name. 11 months of cash payments documented in a neat column beside the facility's own signed rental agreement. And finally, the monthly payments to a former employee named Vanessa Cole, each transfer dated, each one a small, deliberate brick in the wall of the Second Life Curtis had been quietly building behind my daughter's back. Curtis stared down at the growing pile of documents in front of him the way a drowning man stares at water rising past his chin, his hands trembling slightly where they rested against the edge of the table, his breathing shallow and uneven. He opened his mouth twice to speak, and twice nothing came out. The practiced charm that carried him through 14 years of my daughter's trust finally, completely abandoning him. Claire's hands began to shake as she read through page after page, her breath coming faster and shallower, tears welling in her eyes not from grief now, but from a rage I had rarely seen in my gentle, quiet daughter. "Who is Vanessa Cole, Curtis?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though it cut through the silent room like a blade. Curtis's face had gone from gray to a pale, sweating white. "Claire, I can explain everything. This isn't what it looks like." "Don't," Claire said, standing abruptly from her chair, the sound of it scraping against the hardwood floor sharp and final. "Don't you dare try to explain this to me at the dinner table in front of our children. Claire, please sit down. Let's talk about this like adults," Curtis said, his voice rising with a particular desperate pitch of a man watching every carefully constructed lie of his life collapse in real time. He turned to me, his eyes wild now, searching for some angle, some argument that might still salvage the evening. "Frank, you don't understand the pressure I've been under. The business, the loans. It just kept piling up, and I didn't know how to tell Claire without her thinking I was a complete failure. I was going to fix it. I swear to you, I was going to fix all of it before anyone ever needed to know." "You weren't trying to fix anything, Curtis," I said evenly. "You were trying to steal $400,000 from a house that was never yours, using a signature you traced off your own son's birthday card. And you were planning to do it quietly enough that none of us would ever find out until the debt collectors showed up at the front door. That isn't a man trying to fix a mistake. That's a man trying to outrun the consequences of dozens of them. That's not fair," Curtis said, though his voice had lost nearly all of its earlier conviction. "Fair," I repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the air. "You want to talk to me about fair, Curtis? At the same table where 10 minutes ago you told a grieving widower he was nothing but a guest in a house he bought for his own daughter? Where was your concern for fairness then?" Emma had begun to cry quietly, and Noah, 14 years old and old enough to understand that something in his family's foundation had just cracked wide open, sat frozen with his eyes fixed on his father, waiting for a denial that never fully came. He looked, in that moment, less like a boy and more like a young man watching the last piece of his childhood quietly dissolve. "Dad," Noah said, his voice thin and unsteady, "is any of this true?" Curtis opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, his eyes dropping to the documents scattered across the white tablecloth, unable to meet his son's gaze. The silence that followed was its own confession, louder and more damning than any words he could have offered. I stood slowly from my chair, feeling every one of my 68 years on my knees and my back, but feeling something else too, something that felt almost like the satisfaction of finally driving the last nail into a contract I had spent years negotiating. I looked directly at Curtis, and I let every ounce of the anger I had been carefully containing rise, finally, to the surface of my voice. "You stood in this room 10 minutes ago and told me I was a guest in a house I bought for my daughter," I said, my voice hard and unshaking. "You told me it was time for me to find a senior community, with a call button by the bed. You said this while attempting to secretly steal $400,000 from the trust that owns this house, while defaulting on debts you never told your wife about, and while funding an entire secret life with money that was never yours to spend. Frank, please, Curtis said, his voice cracking, all his practiced confidence gone now, replaced by the desperate pleading of a man who understood, finally and completely, that he had been caught. I was going to fix everything. I just needed a little more time. You had 2 years, I said. You had 2 years of living in a home I gave you, raising 2 beautiful children who deserve so much better than the example you set for them, and married to a woman who has spent this entire time making excuses for your behavior, because she loved you enough to believe you were simply struggling, not lying. I turned to Claire, whose tears had turned from shock into something fiercer, something closer to the steel I recognized from her mother. Sweetheart, I said gently, the house is legally protected. It belongs to the trust, and I've already instructed Elliot to ensure it stays that way, held for you and the children regardless of what happens next. You will never lose this home because of anything Curtis has done. That was never a risk, even 3 days ago. I made certain of that a very long time ago. Claire nodded, wiping her eyes, though her gaze never left her husband's face. I want him gone tonight, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. I want him out of this house tonight, Dad. You have exactly 2 hours to pack a bag and leave this house, I said, sliding the document across the table to him. Anything beyond personal clothing and belongings stays, pending whatever Claire and her attorney decide regarding the divorce proceedings that will follow. Robert Kessler, the investigator who compiled this entire file, is currently parked outside in a car on the street, documenting your departure. Should you decide 2 hours isn't quite enough time to understand the seriousness of tonight. Curtis looked around the table, at his children's frightened, tear-streaked faces, at his wife's furious, heartbroken eyes, and finally at me, the man he had dismissed as a helpless old widower just minutes earlier. Whatever words he had been preparing to say seemed to die somewhere in his throat. He simply nodded, stood up slowly from the table, and walked out of the dining room without another word, his footsteps heavy and defeated on the stairs. The 2 hours that followed were among the strangest of my life, a quiet, surreal limbo where Claire held her children close on the living room sofa, while I sat nearby, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to give her space to feel whatever she needed to feel. Above us, we could hear Curtis moving to the bedroom he had shared with my daughter for 12 years, drawers opening and closing, the muffled thud of a suitcase being dragged across the floor. He came downstairs exactly 1 hour and 50 minutes after I had given him his deadline, carrying 2 suitcases, his expensive tailored suits crumpled inside them, his face hollowed out and pale in a way that made him look, for the first time since I had known him, genuinely old. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking at his children. Emma, Noah, he said quietly, his voice thick. I love you both. I'm so sorry. Emma turned her face into Claire's shoulder, refusing to look at him, while Noah simply stared, his young face carrying an expression far too complicated for a 14-year-old boy to be forced into wearing. Curtis waited a moment longer, hoping perhaps for some small gesture of forgiveness that did not come, and then he walked out the front door into the cold night air, the same door he had once walked through as a hopeful young man asking my daughter to marry him, now walking out for what would be the very last time as a resident of that house. Before he reached his car, I stepped outside onto the porch, the cold night air biting through my shirt. Curtis stopped on the driveway when he heard the door close behind me, turning slowly to face me, his 2 suitcases sitting at his feet like small, defeated monuments to everything he had just lost. Come to gloat, Frank? He asked, though there was no real fight left in his voice, only exhaustion. No, I said, walking down the porch steps to stand a few feet from him. I came to tell you something, and then I'm going back inside to my family. He waited, watching me warily. I built everything I have with my own 2 hands, I said. I never once, in 68 years, tried to take something that belonged to someone else. Not a contract, not a client, not a dollar. Everything Margaret and I built, we built honestly, even when honest was harder and slower than the alternative. You had every opportunity to build something real here, Curtis. My daughter loved you. My grandchildren adored you. And instead of building anything, You spent 12 years slowly taking things that were never yours to take, right up until you decided the easiest thing to take next was a house that belonged to a dead woman's trust. Curtis's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse than you already do. I continued. I'm telling you because somewhere underneath everything you've done, there might still be a man capable of doing something honest with the rest of his life. I hope, for your children's sake, that you find him, because they're going to need a father eventually, even if it isn't the one who lived in this house. I did not wait for a response. I turned and walked back up the porch steps, leaving him standing alone in the driveway with his 2 suitcases and whatever remained of his pride. I watched through the front window as he loaded his suitcases into his car, sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the engine, his shoulders shaking slightly in a way that suggested he was crying, and then finally pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down the quiet suburban street. I felt no satisfaction watching him go. I felt only a deep, tired relief, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent every ounce of strength he had left protecting the family he loved from a threat that had been living quietly under his own roof. I turned away from the window and walked back into the living room, where Claire sat on the sofa with Emma curled against one side and Noah sitting stiffly on the other, none of them speaking, all 3 of them still absorbing the wreckage of the evening. I lowered myself carefully onto the sofa beside Noah, and for a long moment none of us said anything at all, the 4 of us simply sitting together in quiet aftermath, listening to the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the hallway, the same clock that had ticked through Claire's childhood and now ticked through the strange, painful new beginning. Eventually, Emma reached over and took my hand, her small fingers still slightly cold from the shock of everything she had just witnessed, and I held it tightly, grateful beyond words that whatever else had been broken that night, the people sitting in that room with me remained, stubbornly and completely, still mine to protect. The weeks that followed were not simple ones. Claire filed for divorce within a month, and Elliot Marsh, along with a family law attorney he recommended named Patricia Voss, ensured that every piece of evidence Robert Kessler had gathered was properly documented and protected, guaranteeing that Curtis's fraudulent refinance attempt and his outstanding debts would never become Claire's legal or financial burden. Patricia was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had built her entire career representing spouses on the losing end of exactly this kind of quiet financial betrayal, and she moved through the divorce proceedings with precision that reminded me, more than once, of how I used to move through hostile contract negotiations back when I still ran the company myself. Curtis initially attempted, through his own hastily hired attorney, to claim partial ownership of the Birchwood Lane house, arguing that he had lived there and contributed to its upkeep for 2 years, and therefore deserves some form of equitable consideration in the divorce settlement. That claim collapsed within a single mediation session once Elliot presented the complete trust documentation, along with the forged power of attorney and the title company's own internal fraud report, which had by then been formally filed and flagged within their compliance division. Curtis's attorney withdrew the claim before the mediator had even finished reading through the second page of Elliot's file, and Curtis himself sat through the remainder of that session in a silence far more subdued than the confident, entitled man who had once told me to find a senior community with a call button by the bed. The 3 private lenders Curtis owed money to eventually caught up with him entirely on their own, without any need for me to intervene further, and I later learned through Robert that Curtis had been forced to file for personal bankruptcy just under a year after that dinner. His restaurant supply business shuttered completely, its remaining assets liquidated to satisfy creditors who had far less patience than his family had shown him. Robert mentioned, almost as an afterthought during one of our final phone calls tying up loose threads of the investigation, that Vanessa Cole had ended her relationship with Curtis within 2 months of the divorce filing, apparently unwilling to attach herself to a man now carrying both a shattered marriage and a mountain of unmanageable debt. I felt nothing when I heard that news, no satisfaction, no vindication. Only the quiet confirmation of something I had already understood the night I watched him walk into that restaurant. A man who builds his entire life on borrowed foundations rarely finds anyone willing to stay once those foundations finally give way. The divorce was finalized 11 months after that dinner, and the custody arrangement Patricia Voss negotiated gave Claire primary residence while allowing Curtis supervised, structured visitation with Emma and Noah every other weekend, an arrangement the children's court-appointed counselor felt was appropriate given everything that had come to light. Curtis, to his limited credit, did not fight the arrangement, And over the following 2 years, he made a slow, uneven effort to rebuild some version of a relationship with his children, an effort I watched from a careful distance, neither encouraging nor discouraging it. Because some decisions in a family belong entirely to children who have to live inside them, not to the grandfather standing quietly at the edges. I made the decision not to pursue criminal charges over the forged power of attorney, not out of mercy exactly, but because Claire asked me not to, for the sake of Emma and Noah, who did not need to watch their father face criminal prosecution on top of everything else that had already been taken from them. Elliot warned me this decision might allow Curtis to eventually attempt something similar with someone else, and he was not wrong to warn me. He sat across from me in his office one last time, tapping his pen against the edge of his desk, and told me plainly that in his 30 years of practicing law, men who forged one signature rarely stopped believing they could get away with forging a second, somewhere down the road, with someone less prepared than I had been to catch them. But some decisions in life are not made purely on the basis of what protects you best. Some decisions are made to protect the people you love most, even when it means allowing the person who hurt them to walk away with slightly less consequence than he perhaps deserved. Emma recovered fully from her surgery within a few months, growing stronger and steadier with each passing week, her laughter slowly returning to the house the way spring returns after a long, hard winter. She struggled for a while afterward, not physically but emotionally, waking some nights with bad dreams that had nothing to do with hospitals and everything to do with the sound of her father's voice raised at the dinner table. Claire found her a wonderful child therapist, a patient, gentle woman named Dr. Reyes, who helped Emma slowly untangle the fear and confusion of that period into something she could carry without it weighing down every single day. By the time Emma turned 13, she had become, if anything, more confident than she had ever been before, a sharp, funny, clear-eyed young woman who reminded me, more with each passing year, of Margaret that same age and a few old photographs that still survived. Noah, quieter and more guarded after everything that happened, gradually opened back up over the following year, and I made it a point to spend as much time with him as he would allow, teaching him things his father had never bothered to teach him: how to change the oil in a car, how to read a contract carefully before signing it, how to recognize when someone was trying to talk him into something that did not serve his own best interests. We spent many Saturday mornings in my garage, an old truck engine spread out across a workbench between us, talking about everything and nothing, and I watched slowly, over the following 2 years, as the guarded, frightened boy who had sat frozen at that dinner table grew into a steady, thoughtful young man who asked good questions and, more importantly, knew how to recognize a good answer when he heard one. When Noah graduated high school 4 years later, he asked me, rather than his father, to say a few words at his small graduation dinner, and I stood up in front of that modest gathering of family and close friends and found myself, for the first time in years, unable to get through a toast without my voice cracking. Claire, for her part, found a strength in the aftermath of that dinner that I had not fully seen in her since she was a young woman finishing college, before marriage and motherhood and years of quiet. Exhausting excuse-making had worn down some of her fire. In the first few months after the divorce filing, I watched her move through the house like someone still learning to trust her own footing, second-guessing decisions she once would have made without hesitation, apologizing for things that required no apology at all. But slowly, week by week, I watched the old Claire begin to resurface. The sharp, funny, fiercely capable young woman who used to argue with me across the kitchen table about everything from politics to which contractors should handle the company's new warehouse roof. She returned to school 2 years later to complete a graduate degree in education administration, studying late into the night at that same long oak table after the children had gone to bed, textbooks and laptop balanced precariously among the dinner dishes, refusing my repeated offers to simply pay for a housekeeper or a tutor, insisting that she needed to do this particular thing entirely on her own. She eventually became the principal of the very elementary school where she had once taught 3rd grade, a role she has now held for 6 years, and I have never once, in all that time, heard anyone describe my daughter as anything less than formidable. She built, in the years following that terrible dinner, an entirely new life, one built on her own foundation, rather than one quietly propped up by someone else's borrowed confidence, exactly the way her mother had raised her to build things. She began seeing someone new about 3 years after the divorce, a quiet, steady man named Michael who taught high school mathematics and had never, In the 2 years I have watched him closely, shown a single flicker of the entitlement or the hunger I had once seen so clearly in Curtis's eyes. Michael proposed to Claire last spring, in the garden behind her house, among the very roses I had transplanted years earlier from the home Margaret and I once shared. And when Claire called to tell me the news, her voice carried a lightness I had not heard from her in over a decade. As for the house on Birchwood Lane, I formally transferred full ownership from the Ashcroft Trust directly into Claire's name outright. A gift I should have given her from the beginning, rather than the complicated, quiet arrangement that had left her vulnerable to exactly the kind of deception Curtis had attempted. Elliot warned me gently that removing the trust protective structure meant the house would no longer carry the same legal insulation should Claire ever remarry and face a similar situation down the road. I told him I understood the risk, but that I had learned something important through everything that happened that year, something Margaret had perhaps understood all along and I had only now caught up to. Protection built entirely in secret, however well-intentioned, can only guard against a danger you specifically anticipated. It cannot replace a daughter's own clear-eyed understanding of exactly what she owns and exactly what she is worth. I sat Claire down at that same long oak table and walked her through every document, every account, every detail of the trust, holding nothing back this time, the way I should have done from the very beginning. I stayed on in my small guest room for another year after that dinner, watching my grandchildren grow steadier and happier, before eventually deciding it was time to find a smaller place of my own nearby, close enough to visit every week, far enough to give Claire and her children the full independence they deserved after everything they had endured. I bought a modest 2-bedroom house about 15 minutes away, small enough that I did not need to hire anyone to help maintain it, with a backyard just large enough for another small garden, another set of transplanted roses cut carefully from the bushes outside Claire's house, which had themselves been cut from the bushes at our old house on Larkspur Lane. 3 generations of the same stubborn, thorny roots following our family from house to house, refusing to be left behind. I also did something else in the months following that dinner, something I had been considering quietly for years, but had never found the right moment to actually pursue. I worked with Elliot to establish a modest scholarship fund through the Ashcroft Trust, named after Margaret, intended specifically for children of small business owners in our community whose families had gone through sudden financial hardship, the kind of hardship that so often forces a promising young person to abandon their education entirely in order to help keep a struggling household afloat. It felt, in some strange way, like the most honest use I could find for money that had nearly been stolen out from under my own family by someone who had never understood the difference between deserving something and simply wanting it badly enough to lie for it. The fund has now put 4 young people through their first 2 years of community college, with 2 more scheduled to receive support this coming fall. And every single time I sign one of those small scholarship checks, I think of Margaret sitting at that card table in the back of our first tiny shop, counting out change with a steadiness that never once wavered no matter how uncertain our future actually was. I still visit every Sunday for dinner. We sit at that same long oak table, the one Margaret and I bought 31 years ago, and the room that once held so much tension and quiet fear now holds nothing but the easy warmth of family that survived something it should never have had to survive. Emma is 17 now, taller than her mother, already fielding acceptance letters from colleges I only recognize because Noah insists on reading them aloud at the dinner table with far more enthusiasm than his sister can usually muster before her second cup of coffee. Noah works part-time at a small auto shop 2 towns over, saving toward a degree in mechanical engineering, and he still calls me most Saturday mornings just to talk through whatever problem he is currently chasing under the hood of whatever second-hand car he is trying to keep running. Claire's wedding to Michael is scheduled for next spring, in that same backyard, among those same transplanted roses, and she has already asked him to walk her down what will amount to a very short aisle of folding chairs arranged between the rose bushes and the old maple tree Margaret and I planted the week Claire was born. I have started, quietly, working on the toast I intend to give, though I suspect I will need several attempts before I manage to get through it, without my voice failing me somewhere around the 3rd sentence. I think about that dinner often, the one where a man who had never earned anything he claimed to own stood up and told me I no longer belonged in a house I had quietly protected for my daughter's entire family. I think about how close he came to believing his own arrogance would be enough to erase everything Margaret and I had spent our lives building. I think about the particular kind of quiet strength it takes to sit still, to smile calmly, and to let a man dig his own grave with every arrogant word he speaks, right up until the moment you hand him the shovel, and show him exactly how deep the hole he built for himself truly is. I have had a great deal of time since that dinner to think about what family actually means, once you strip away all the assumptions people carry into it, without ever examining them closely. Family is not a title stamped onto a marriage certificate, and it is certainly not a set of keys handed over to whoever shouts the loudest at the dinner table. It is something built slowly, deliberately, the same patient way Margaret and I built a company out of a single storefront and 4,000 borrowed dollars, one honest decision at a time, stacked carefully on top of the last, until eventually the whole structure is strong enough to survive whatever storm eventually comes looking for a way inside. A house built on love can survive almost anything. But a house built on someone else's quiet sacrifice will always, eventually, reveal exactly whose hands it really belongs to. And the man foolish enough to mistake a quiet old widower's patience for weakness will always, in the end, be the one left standing in an empty driveway, wondering how he ever managed to lose everything to someone who never once had to raise his voice.